In this video, I'll review how to trigger CSS animations when elements are scrolled into view. When you add a CSS animation, typically it will play immediately or after some defined delay. However, if the element you wish to animate is below the fold and off screen, it might animate without the user ever even seeing it. Sometimes you want to enable CSS animations when those elements come into view. To do this, you'll need some good old-fashioned JavaScript, which I've provided here. I've added comments in this code about how to use it, but I'll also demonstrate some use cases for you here. By way of some history, I used to do this through jQuery and tracking elements based on their offsets, but now you can do this with vanilla JavaScript, and that's what this code does, and it uses the intersection observer API, which allows you to determine if objects are within the viewport. This can be useful for tracking ads and for doing things like lazy loading and infinite scrolling. This API might be used, but it's great for also triggering animations once they come into the viewport. The way that I have this set up to work is you simply have to define what elements you want to track, and you do that by adding the animate class to anything in the HTML that you want to actually keep track of. And then the JavaScript will add an in-view class to that element when that element is on the screen. So just a quick peek at the code, which you really don't have to understand in order to use here. But we're using the document, the DOM content loaded, so that we can put this in the head of the document. It waits till the document's ready before it executes this. And then we use this intersection observer. And what we're doing is we're looking for all the elements that have the animate class on them. And then we're observing each of those. And when they enter the viewport, they'll add an in-view class to their class list. And when they exit the viewport, they'll remove that in-view class. This is actually really easy to implement. And I've got a web page ready to go for that. It already has some animation on here, but you can imagine that this animation was down here, we would have never seen that happen. So for example, this book that's here, let's say I wanted to fade that book in. If we just played the animation and users didn't scroll down right away, they would just miss that animation altogether. Let's explore animating that book when it's in view. So I'm going to turn back to my code, and in my HTML, I've already got an image in there with the class of book. And so I've also got some CSS that references that book. So traditionally, if I was going to animate that, I might add an @keyframes animation, for example. Maybe I'll call it book anim. And I would have that go from, for example, an opacity of 0 if we were going to fade this in. And we'll have that then end with an opacity of 1. And so that would be a simple animation. I could simply add that to the book, and I've got that with a book class here by referencing the animation property and then adding our animation property name here. So the animation name of book anim, giving it a time. Let's say it takes 2 seconds, and maybe some sort of timing function. I'll just leave the default of ease. I'm going to go ahead and save that. Make sure my HTML is also saved. And then I'll refresh the browser window that's here, and what you'll see is that book would fade in. Now, if we did our refresh up here, we would never see that book fade in. It already is faded in. So unless I happen to refresh in the right place, we're not getting that, we're not going to ever see that animation. What we'd like to do is trigger that animation only when the object comes into view. We'll trigger the animation. So to do that is simple. What we have to do is turn to our HTML, and we have to add the animate class to any elements that we might want to track, that we think we might want to add some animation to when they're in view. That's the way this JavaScript is going to work. So I'm going to add the animate class to the class list for that image. And certainly you can have multiple classes or multiple class names assigned to the same object. And so I've got both the class of book and the class of animate there. Now our JavaScript is going to track that element. And what we have to do is turn to our CSS and say, hey, the JavaScript is going to add an in-view class to this whenever it's in view. So I'm going to actually reference Things with the book class that also have the InView class, that's where I'm going to actually add my animation. So instead of initially, I'll add that once that content is in view, it's going to then add that animation. I'll go ahead and hit save both here and also on my HTML to make sure I should do just a save all, I suppose. And then I'll come over here and say, okay, let's refresh this. And I can have my normal animation, but once I scroll down the page and I see that book, that's when that animation triggers. You'll notice when I go back off screen, it's going to do it again. So anytime it goes out of screen, it's going to then reset that animation whenever we're in view. And so that's the beauty of this code, is that it only triggers the animation once that content comes into view. Now, beyond using the animation property, we could also use the transition property. So let's say what I wanted to do is make these headings here animate into place. And I want to sort of use that simply as a transition. Because we're adding a class, we could not necessarily have to call an @keyframes animation to make this work. And so you'll see what I mean. So once I get to this element right here, I've already added the class of animate to this h3. And so we're going to be tracking that particular object. So then what I'm going to do is go up here where I'm targeting my sections, and I'm going to say, hey, if there's any change on that h3, I'm going to have a, let's say, 1 second animation when that happens. And I'll make that ease in and ease out. Now all I have to do is to define sort of a difference here between my regular h3 and what the h3 is actually going to look like when it's in view. So I'm going to go ahead and say that one is going to be when it's in view, and I'm going to change some things once in view. So when the section is actually in view, maybe I actually have the font size normally just start at like 1 rem, but we bring the font size to 4 rem once it's in view. So we'll scale it by scaling the font size in this case. And it's going to transition that and animate to that. So I'll save this, and I'll make sure that my HTML is also saved. And we'll come back over to our document here and do a little refresh. You'll see that we're getting that scaling that's happening. And that font size is changing. That font size is changing, but it's going to do that once on the screen. And I've got that as well on this other element down below, which is also an h3 with the animate class. So you can kind of see how that might work with a transition. We can either call the animation @keyframes animation, or we can have animations that happen on transition based on whether or not that InView class is assigned. I think these transition animations are quite a bit of fun. Let's say I wanted to animate this border that's underneath that as well. I'm going to turn back to my code, and I'm going to go over here and take a look. I've been adding that border as using the pseudo class of after and giving it a width of 80% here. But let's say what I did was add a transition to that, and I'm going to go ahead and say transition, and we'll transition all the elements, and it's going to take maybe just like, let's say it takes 1 second, and I'm going to actually do this with a slight delay on it as well, like a 500 millisecond delay, and we'll go ahead and just have that have the ease timing function on it. Okay, and then what I want to do is trigger that change based on whether or not the h3 has the InView class on it. So I'm going to say h3 InView, and that means it would have that class, and then I'm also going to target that after element that's here. So once that h3 has the InView class, we can make some changes to this. And so what I'm going to do is change the width. So once it's in view, I'll make the width 80%, but before it's in view, I might have the width be just like, let's say 10% or something like that. And so when I save this now and we return back to our document and we do a little refresh, you'll see that we're going to get that, and it's on a little bit of a delay, a 500 millisecond delay. So that animates once we come into place here. So as I scroll down the screen, we'll see that that sort of triggers that particular animation. I think maybe I'd like that to also kind of fade in, and so what I could do to make this happen is add maybe a change to the border color. So let's say initially that border color was faded out, and what I'm going to do is just add 0, 0 as an alpha to my definition here, and that would mean that it's transparent to start. And then what we can do is change that border to be FF at the end, or fully opaque for the last two values of it. And what we could do is maybe even change the width of that border here, so it's just a little bit weightier as it comes in. With those changes in place and saved, I can take a look at what happens inside the browser here, and when I refresh, we'll get that line sort of being added and building itself out as we go. Fun. All right, so those things trigger as we scroll down the page. All right, one thing that I might want to do is play around with scaling or translations. And so I'm going to take that book element, and there's going to be a bit of a hiccup with this one. And so it's useful to troubleshoot that and kind of explain what's happening with it. So let's say what I wanted to do was scale this book. In addition to fading it in, I also want to scale it. Well, I'm going to come back to my code and find where that book is. And what we could do is, with that book animation, let's say we also add a scale property to this. So I'm going to say scale of 0 to start, or I could use transform scale, but we can just use the quicker way of writing it. So I'll also have that then, go from 0 scale and 0 opacity to opacity 1 and scale of 1. So if I save this and we return back to the browser and take a look at what that change did, it's fine here if I'm in view, but we're going to get some weird behavior potentially. See how it's flickering? And that weird flicker behavior, or it's a little like unpredictable. The reason for that is that that object, once we scale it to 0, it actually becomes a lot smaller. And so as soon as it triggers the animation to be small because of the 0 scale, it's then out of view for a second, like right when it comes onto the screen. So that book is there normally. And as we come onto the screen and barely are in view, the book itself goes to a really small size, and then it's off screen. And once it's off screen, it triggers the JavaScript to remove the InView class, and then it goes back to its normal scale, and then it's triggered again. So this it gets into this kind of triggering loop there with the scaling, because it actually kind of moves from on-screen to off-screen to on-screen to off-screen, and it's sort of cycling. It's really a weird behavior, and one of the things a little bit maybe more unique to doing scaling, or if you're working with certain types of positioning where that object might not be on view and then it comes into view, you could get these kind of hiccuping, janky effects that are happening there. And so to solve that, we could simply make some changes to the way that we're sort of working within our code. If I come back to this, what I might do is wrap this book in a figure tag. So let's say I added the figure tag to that. And I'm going to go ahead and wrap that where the closing of the figure is on the other side of my image. And I'm going to add the class of animate not to the book itself, but rather to the figure itself. So I'm going to go ahead and do this. And we'll be able to make a solution here for this, because the thing that will scale is the book, but we can track whether it's the figure itself that's in view, so that we're not like adding the InView class over and over again to the book itself and scaling it out of view when we do. So I'm going to add the animate class to the figure instead, which will be our container here for this. And then what we'll have to do is a couple definitions for that figure. So I'm going to say, hey, if you're a figure with the animate class on it, let's say specifically, then what we want to do is have you have a particular height. So let's say we have the height that the book was, which was 300 pixels for that book. I'm also going to just give it no margin, and that will be the containing element for the book itself. And so this really shouldn't change too much, but once we actually get our book in view, what we're going to do instead is say, hey, when the figure is in view, then that's when we want this book animation to kick in. So the figure, when that's in view, then we animate the book. And so it's not the book that's sort of changing this, it's the figure itself. And the figure won't be scaling, only the book itself will be scaling. So once we've added that, and we've also updated our HTML with the figure wrapping that, we can try that out in the browser and kind of see how that works. So I'll do a little refresh. There's a scale. And now when we come on screen, we're not getting that little sort of weird flickering effect, because the figure itself is always there. We can maybe demonstrate that a little bit better even if we added more CSS to the figure. Let's say we added a border for that. So I might say I wanted like a border on the top, and I'm going to say solid 4 pixels. And I'm going to use this color I've been kind of using here. And I'll also want a border on the bottom, let's say, same thing, for this particular image that's there. So I'm going to say that I also want one on the bottom. Okay, so I've got a border on the top and bottom, and I'll save that out. We'll take a look at what's happening inside our browser. And so now that figure has this border on both sides. We can kind of see when that comes in. Now I noticed that the book, this isn't fully transparent. It's on the same blue background. And so it's covering up the bottom here, because the image is 300 pixels, and what's happening is that the border is pushing the image down just a little bit. So what I would need to do as well is change the size based on the border. So I'm adding basically 8 pixels. I need 8 more pixels of room in order to see my content without it being pushed down. So I'll change the height there to that, resave that, and now when that book scales in, it shouldn't go on top. There we go. So as the border comes in, really as the figure comes in, that's when the book is being triggered to animate as well. So when this element is in view, we're triggering that element to animate. That can be kind of a nice use case there. And I think I like the separation with the border maybe a little bit better anyway. So we could see that. You know, other things we could do, we could also work with translations to move this in, just to explore that really quickly. Let's say I added a translate element to this where my transformation is going to include translate on X, let's say. And maybe I start this like, 500 pixels in translation, and then we'll move it back into place while this kind of scales. And we can see that the transform would add to this as well. Now, I could see trying to change the transformation origins on this as this is scaling. We might get some interesting effects here, but I'm going to move it, and we'll have that translate from 500 pixels over back into place. And we can save that, take a look at what that would look like in the browser. And basically that's going to move that element now. It's going to sort of animate from the right in, but because it's also scaling, it almost gives it this sort of moves to the right, moves back to the left kind of quality to it, which I think is kind of interesting. If I got rid of the scaling part of this, then that would be, or let's say I just said scale of the same value, then it should just sort of move into place. And we could refresh that and kind of see that it would just move as if it was off screen, kind of coming on screen. So that's another way that I could play with that animation. Okay, so lots of different options here. The key thing throughout this code, if you're working with this animate in view JavaScript that I've provided, you simply need to add the animate class to anything you want to track within your HTML. And then in the CSS, you're going to add this in view option saying, hey, how do you want this to change once in view? Then you could either trigger the animation when it's in view, and that would be, right, for example, once something is in view, you'd call the animation property on that, or you could add a transition for that element and say, hey, we're going to transition any change to this element, and when the element is in view and makes that change, that transition would kick in. Okay, I hope you have fun triggering CSS animations when elements are scrolled into view.